thank you guys so much for having us here today, because I think all of us understand how important this climate issue is, and it's very, very daunting. It can be very depressing, but there's hope, and we've been working on this a long time, and I am so really, really excited about what I have to tell you today. I mean, this is really incredible. I mean, we don't have to go into this issue, because I think most of the people in this room, if not all of the people in this room, understand that climate change is here, it's happening, and there's very, very unfortunately, there's a disconnect between what the American people believe and what our politicians want to do. And that's part of what Citizens Climate Lobby wants to do, is to bring, reestablish that connection between politicians and all the rest of us. And as I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, and it's also collaborating with George Mason University, and they do all of these studies about the opinion of people about various aspects of climate change. And as you see, 70% of Americans are worried about climate change. So this is a real issue that we can get some work on. And it's affecting us here. We don't have to tell you that, but I'm sorry for the small print. And we're going to move a little faster, because I think we're a little strapped for time. But if you want, you can actually go online. You can find algorithms that'll tell you how our climate is changing, and you can actually plug in your city or your zip code, and you can plug in the number of the degrees that you want to look at, and it will tell you how many more days above that level there will be per unit time. And as you, is that focused? That's not focused. That is focused. Okay. So yeah, by 2050, you can see we're gonna. This is where we are now, down there. But by 2050, we're going to have a little more than 35 days higher per year, higher than 90 degrees here. So yeah, I mean, we don't have to go into this, but we all know we have a very, very limited amount of time to prevent the worst outcomes of climate change. So this is the good news. We know how to solve this, and just like anything else in life, if you want people to do less of it, you make it more expensive. But what happens if I should say that this is not just a pie in the sky idea. This is Nobel Prize winning thought. Recent Nobel Prize in economics was awarded to people who have discussed pricing carbon to stop climate change. And this is, we're talking about bipartisan today, and that's a tough push, but this has to be bipartisan. And economists on both sides of the political spectrum agree that this is the way we're going to stop climate change. And what we have here is this little graphic. This is what happens if you price climate change and you don't protect people from the rising prices. They get very upset. This is Paris a few months ago. A lot of it was that taxes were rising because of pricing gasoline, and they weren't taxing rich people. And the rest of citizens had to pay rising prices for gas, and it was very upsetting. So what happens? The thought is, well, give the money back. You price carbon, collect it, give the money back to citizens instead of the government keeping it. And that sounds like a great idea, but 10 years ago, or less than 10 years ago, Citizens Climate Lobby did some investigations. Well, what's going to happen to the economy if we do that? How bad is it going to hurt us? And so what's interesting is that the whole party line has been that there's going to be a disconnect between pricing carbon and helping the economy. That if you price carbon, the economy is going to crash. Well, that's not what happens. If you price carbon and give the money back to us, the economy prospers. It adds, and the economic modeling study shows that carbon emissions go down, GDP goes up, and we create jobs. So we've been working on this a long time. And, sure. And so we've been working on this a long time, and we've been meeting very respectfully, forming relationships with our members of Congress, and CCL, as Jen mentioned, has been at this for over 10 years. And in the lame duck Congress, we finally got a bipartisan bill introduced in the House, and then a few weeks later, the sister bill introduced into the Senate called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which is very, very close to what we've been trying to get introduced for all these years, and it's absolutely incredible. It has, whoops, I'm sorry, I passed a slide, but that's okay, we're sure. What's this all about? The Act puts a price on carbon at the point of entry into the economy. That's very important. It doesn't let everything come down to like the pump or the power station, but there are only about 200 places where fuel enters the economy, and it's very easy to administer, okay? The price starts low as to not shock the economy. It grows over time, and what happens to that fee? It comes back to all of us, minus a very, very small administration fee. But this fee is distributed to all Americans on an equal basis. Children 19 and under get a half share. And this goes to all citizens and legal residents, okay? There is a border carbon adjustment, which means, well, what is that? Well, if companies are making stuff in the United States using more expensive energy, it's harder for them to sell it abroad. The border adjustment is going to kind of discourage companies from moving to another location where they might be able to produce their goods more cheaply. And so what happens is that if goods come into the country from some other location where a similar fee is not in effect, there is a fee placed on it at the border as it comes into the country. If our companies sell to a country that doesn't have a similar plan, they actually get a rebate as the goods are exported. Yes?
What I'm not understanding is, how is this money returned to people?
That's a great question. And the way it comes is actually the same way you might get a Social Security check or an income tax rebate. And people who do not have who don't pay taxes, people who don't pay taxes, there will be a short form that they would have to fill out and submit. But that's a good question. So there is, an issue which sorry, I skipped that slide too. But there's an issue that may be important to a lot of people here, and it's important to a lot of us, is that there will be a limited regulatory adjustment. In other words, and let me go back to that slide and see if I can get it back. Nope, maybe not. Okay, so there we go. All right. So what this means, unfortunately or unfortunately, is that there will be, it kind of limits the ability of the government to price carbon emissions or regulate carbon emissions in other ways. And what happens here is that it does not limit the government from from regulating emissions other than how they affect carbon. So in other words, the government is still entitled to regulate what power plants do in some respects, or they can regulate particulate emissions, they can regulate methane emissions. And what happens is several years down the line, if this plan does not meet or exceed expectations, then the actual price on carbon rises. So this is, you know, it really is a great plan. It's effective. It will reduce emissions. The plan has, by economic modeling, shows that it's going to reduce emissions by 40% within 12 years. It will reduce emissions by 90% of 2016 levels within 20 years. And we choose 2016 levels because they're 3% lower than 2015 levels. 2015 levels were about equivalent to 1990 levels. And economists and scientists both believe, both understand that this is going to work. It's good for us because we're not going to be breathing polluted air. It's also good for us because the money comes back to us. And the modeling, and this is really important, the modeling shows that 2/3 of the lower income groups will either come out even or make a profit under this plan. The higher income groups will still get money back, and they will lose really only a very small percent of their annual income. It only costs, you know, less than a percent of annual income to the higher income groups. It creates jobs. The modeling shows that over 2 million jobs will be created within 10 years. And more than yeah, as you said, this is very important that it has to be done in a bipartisan fashion. And why is bipartisanship so important? Well, first of all, our country is really losing touch. We're losing touch with each other. And we really can't, I mean, aside from climate, we have to be working together to help our country be moving forward. But that's not the real reason. I mean, the real reason is that we all, you know, Republicans, Democrats, or independents, as you can see in one of those charts that I showed you before, we all want action on climate change. And it's, you know, what happens, and you can see with, for instance, with the Affordable Care Act, you know, you pass it with a Democratic Congress, and then the Republicans come into power and they want to pull it out. We don't want that to happen regarding climate. Climate is too important to have it be a political football, so it has to be bipartisan. And it's very important that it's revenue neutral because now we're not picking and choosing. We're not going to say, well, we're going to take away the subsidies for this industry, we're going to give subsidies there. And if we start picking and choosing and making bills that are going to affect different aspects of our energy economy, what's going to happen is that these bills are going to take years to get through Congress. They're going to go back and forth. They're going to go through that sausage maker of, sausage machine of legislation. And 5 or 8 years from now, we're going to be back where we started. This addresses everything. And I'm excited to say, at least this slide is now outdated, but this is from the last Congress. We had a bipartisan, 3 Republicans and I can't count the Republicans, Democrats and Republicans in the House, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican in the Senate, bipartisan bills, sister bills introduced into our last Congress. There's already been a bill introduced into this Congress in the House. We have, there are a lot of positive things going on behind the scenes in the Senate. We fully expect the bill to be reintroduced into the Senate. And we, I think, all of us can understand how important this type of legislation is. This is really almost historical. This is over 10 years since a carbon bill has been introduced into the legislature. So, yes, sir.
Do you have the bill number?
I do not have the new bill number. I have the old bill number. And actually, we have
Maybe
some.
73.
We have. You have it?
I think they have a number, but they don't have the text up yet even.
HR 7173.
No, in the
That's
Senate.
this is, we have some handouts, but that's the old bill number, but the new one is very, very similar, yes.
How will this bill affect the potential inflationary aspects of carbon fee taxes to producers of fossil fuel, who will then pass along those costs to consumers
Well,
through,
that-
you
it's
know,
not
many,
go-
many products in our.
You're absolutely right, and that's really the whole point of those. It's not going to tell producers what they can charge. But what's gonna happen is this, as the price of fossil fuels rise, people are gonna wanna buy cheaper products. And the cost of renewable energy is almost at this point equivalent to energy produced by fossil fuels. It'll soon be cheaper. And so producers are going to be encouraged to use less expensive energy in the same way. I mean, we have a choice. We can buy oranges for, $5, or we can buy oranges for $3.75. We're going to pick the cheaper one. So they
So could I-
produce. Yes, go ahead.
I think, so the price is starting in the new bill, I think, at $15 per ton
Right.
of carbon pollution potential. And then initially, it was intended to go up $10 per ton every single year. But now, in the new bill that just was introduced into the Senate, that will be pegged to inflation, if that was your question.
I'm not sure. Maybe
So-
I misunderstood your question.
Yeah.
I apologize.
So it will go up with inflation, and then it'll have those same exact impacts that Bart was talking
I'm
about.
just thinking in terms of the impact on consumers who are purchasing things in our, supply chain.
Yes.
That use fossil fuel products,
Yes.
that then the consumer will have to pay higher price.
Let me address that again, because I may have skimmed over that too quickly. So what happens when a price gets put on the fuel as it comes into the economy? The cost of everything goes up. Our carbon footprint, only about 30 or 40% of our carbon footprint comes from gasoline and electricity and the oil we use in our house. 60% of our fossil fuel footprint comes from stuff. So everything will become more expensive, and but the idea is that the money, and that's what I meant when I said the lower 2/3 of income groups are going to be protected from the rise in prices. It'll either come out ahead or come out even. The higher third will pay a little bit more as the cost of fuel rises, but you have to realize that every year as the tax goes up, the rebate to us goes up. One of the things I like about this plan is that our first rebate check will come the month before the fee goes into effect. So,
Just to,
say again?
How about the household impact study?
Oh, wait, go ahead.
Also, CCL has done a lot of analytical work, and so they contracted out to do a household impact study, and so that just supports exactly what Bart was saying, because they actually looked at the impact. They divided the demographics into quintiles, into fifths, and they can show in those analyses that because of the higher carbon footprint that higher income people have, they actually kind of end up paying in more than they get back. But those that are at the mid and the lower end, they don't take air flights, they don't have two cars, they don't have a high carbon. They actually end up getting back more than they end up paying maybe for extra heating fuel.
if I understood you correctly, you mentioned that citizens would get back
Yes.
a carbon dividend.
Correct.
Will other members of our
Community? Yeah.
also,
Well-
people who are not citizens,
People who are, the way the bill is structured, people who are citizens or legal residents of the United States will get rebates. Yes? No, go ahead. I'll get to you.
You kind of already answered this, but when this was presented to our climate group in my town, a small business owner was there, he's, I think, a construction person, so he drives around in a big truck all the time. His question was, you know, I'm gonna be buying a lot of fuel, but the only way I'm gonna come out even on that is, I'm a small business owner, I'm a single business owner. No, I'm gonna have to charge it back to my customers. And how much can a person like that do that? And I think it's just a question, but I think it's important because we have a lot of small business owners and they tend to be people who, you know,
Right.
to them this is socialism and they don't.
Right. Well, I can see that. We do have, you know, we can really go into the weeds on this. And we can, I mean, the modeling studies really break this whole thing down into different types of industries, and we can discuss that. But just on a general, overall basis, if the business, you know, and the way this is designed and the way it's been thought out, if a business passes on the cost, their increased costs, that is what that rebate to citizens is designed to help out with. So they actually will have the extra disposable income to pay those increased costs. So people are going to end up, and this is it's not an inconsiderable amount. I mean, starts out, you can be getting what, $50 or $80 a month,
Yeah, it goes.
and it goes up every year. Yeah.
The other thing I just wondered, forgive me, I'm a pragmatist, but I
Sure.
don't see Congress passing this. What is the great,
That's why.
Magic Garden don't work, I guess.
That's why we're here, and that's why we need you guys. I mean, this is what, I mean, this is, it's not magic. It's hard work on a daily basis. That is, you know, and that's why we have 100,000 people across the United States. This is actually this group is international. We have people working on similar plans in several countries internationally, including we have 10 chapters in Africa. Only 10, but there may be more. That's why we meet with our legislators regularly. We do these outreaches. It's not a light push. It's a heavy lift, I should say. It's a very heavy lift. But on the other hand, we've been working on this for 10 years or more, and now we have bipartisan support. I mean, this is really, I mean, it's incredible for us because it's like all of a sudden a light at the end of the tunnel. And now we have something to push through. And I think that with the new Congress and with the new public awareness that continues to grow about climate change, and this, all this public outreach and bipartisan support, I think that, if we don't get it through this Congress, we'll get it through the next Congress, but it will come through, and it's going to happen. And especially with, Ocasio-Cortez and her Green New Deal, I mean, people are really pushing for this stuff.
They didn't allow.
I'm sorry, John, you had a question.
I have a few comments.
Yes.
I make science, and I just, I think we have to come back a little bit to the science of climate change. And I don't agree with everything that you guys are saying, although basically we're on the same page. First of all, carbon, you make it sound like carbon is a bad thing. Carbon is, arguably the most important element of life. And when we look at climate, we know that the climate is really regulated by carbon, water, oxygen, and some minerals, which are the basic elements of life, and which life sustains. And the process of life is actually the thing that regulates the climate. It's life itself that regulates the climate. And the carbon factor is actually really just 5% of what is controlling the climate. Most of our climate is controlled by the water cycle and the hydrological cycles. And I could go into this in great detail, but the water cycle, I mean, when we think of climate change, we think of, storms, hurricanes, droughts, fires, increasing heat sinks, and so forth. That's all water. And there is a lot of ways we can affect water. And the most important way we can affect water, and the reason that regenerative agriculture is so important, is the soil. Because the soil is this living substrate which holds the water. And that's what good farming is. Good farming holds the water. And chemical farming kills the life in the soil, and the water runs off. So the gut problem I have with this is that even if we stopped our pollution right now, it would take hundreds of years for the level of carbon to come down in and of itself, because we've saturated the ocean and the carbon just comes out of the ocean.
You're right, and not only that, the ocean is the heat sink for our planet.
So we have to attack all of these things at the same time. And I think that one of the problems is that the carbon equation, the carbon part of the equation, has become this incredible political football. And you're fighting the hardest part of the problem. The part that has become so removed from what's actually going on, it's because of politics, that it's, I'm sorry, I'll be quick. You're fighting the hardest part of the problem when there is a huge part of the problem that we should be addressing at the same time.
Well, I'm not going to argue with that. That is a major problem, and certainly there's no argument to really anything that you're saying. But I think that just from the standpoint that you cannot separate out one aspect of climate change from another.
That's right.
But what we have here is something that needs to be addressed dramatically. I mean, there's no question that the level of CO2 in the atmosphere has risen dramatically over the past 100 years. There's no question about the correlation between the rise in global temperature and the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And there's lots of ways to get carbon out of the atmosphere. And a lot of the reasons for our these extreme weather events is related to carbon in the atmosphere, because the warm air holds more moisture. But this is what is extraordinarily attractive about this bill is that it is a small government bill with minimal regulation that could clearly address I'm not saying it's going to solve the climate crisis, but it can clearly address in a very, very effective way the climate crisis. Now, this, the modeling shows that this, if we get this passed, this could comes just about to the point where we might make 1.5 degree. We might limit to 1.5. It's going to be in the 2 degree range, but it could get close to 1.5 degree. That's not saying that we don't need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. I totally agree with you. We need to do everything we can to protect our world for our children. Okay? We're experiencing the problems now. Our kids are going to feel it worse. We have to do everything we can to do that. I'm sorry, you're done?
No, I just had a point I wanted to make.
Yeah.
Well, in relation to what you're saying here, I think the other piece of it is that you're trying to get people to wrap their minds around this stuff, and you have 7 out of 10 Americans who are somewhat worried about something that in 12 years could be the end of the planet or something like that. That's not great. You have 3% who are not worried about it at all. And what I think you're doing here is identifying and working on a problem that can be solved. That doesn't mean that those other things that you're talking about, John, aren't as important.
But
But-
it's all connected.
I know, but you gotta start with some, so, you know, we gotta make some progress with on one front.
Right. I think we have one more, I'm sorry, in fact, you've been trying for a long time.
Yeah, just a general question. Where can we see any reference to the economists and scientists that are involved with this and what their models are?
Okay, so if you look at citizensclimatelobby.org, you'll get an incredible amount of information.
There was just an article in the New York Times, that was a bunch of, economists and, scientists, showed support. It was like a few days ago.
Yeah.
It's kind of a wonky article, but it kind of explains why they support it.
Thanks.
Terrific.
One more?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it just seems like this is a little too perfect. So.
Thank you.
What my concern is, like, what this woman brought up, the contractor who drives around in his truck and so he's just gonna pass it on. So it's like giving a little bit of money to the person who's been incarcerated for 40 years and go, okay, you're on your own. So why isn't some of the money going into innovation, training contractors how to deal with net zero, something like that, rather than, it looks like we're gonna have another wave of opioid epidemic if you just leave,
You have to do that.
okay, you're on your own.
Yeah.
Are you gonna give
This
me money
revolutionary
back?
change, but you're on your own.
The bill that Dee Dee has been working on, as I understand it, I've talked about is that with her, is that the money doesn't go to the citizens, this is a different bill. It doesn't go back to the people, it goes back to farmers and small farmers and people who are doing regenerative agriculture. And they're trying to now figure out a way to measure the carbon in the soil so that there can be some equity between taxing the amount that the polluters are putting into the atmosphere and giving benefits to people who are pulling it down into life in the soil. So there are plans out there to give it back.
So that type of benefit
Other
that
than
needs to
the cash.
spread into other professions, not this one.
When-
Now, many-
Great idea.
When
but-
CCL first was thinking of, what are we going to do? So we're starting from scratch, what are we going to do? The question was, what is the most effective, politically possible, and what is going to be most effective both in terms of economy and in terms of reducing the carbon emissions? They came up with this not because they thought, oh, this is a grand idea, but because when they asked an economic modeling firm to do the modeling on a national and also local basis, they found putting the carbon fee on in a rising way and sending the money directly back to people didn't answer all the questions. It was the single most effective thing to do. Now, that's something that people can argue back and forth because there is no perfect solution. But what we found is I very much trust that modeling because it's not like doing polls. It's not like somebody picking something out of a hat. It's a professional group that's their job, is to figure out what would be the total effect of this. And the total effect is substantially reduced emissions, an increase in GNP, and supporting and helping those who are most vulnerable and not really hurting the rest of us. That doesn't answer all the questions. There is no legislation that will answer the questions. But
You know,
this is,
I'm sorry, but I just want to throw something out here because there are certain groups that are protected in this bill, which I kind of glossed over. But agriculture is a really, really important part of our lives, and especially of our economy here in upstate New York. And this bill actually protects farmers from the increase in fuel prices. And they, all they have to do is keep track of what they're paying for their diesel, and they will get refunds. So, they're here and there is stuff to protect the groups that are going to be most impacted by this.